But my first question for you is sort of picking up on the thread that you left for us when you stated that India's standing as a secular democracy is tremendously besieged at the moment. Right? And I think while that's a consensus agreement across sort of civil society and and activists and intellectuals, the opinions on the cause and therefore the solution to this crisis are somewhat split, right? With some holding it to be a political problem of a vacuum in the opposition space politically, and others holding it to be a problem of society, arguing that the weakness of civil society as an institution and the weakness of social solidarities in India are to blame. And I'm wondering if you can weigh in on this debate with where you think the problem is, and therefore what the next steps are for reconstruction of Indian democracy.
Thank you, Ravi. It's a good question, and of course there are no easy answers to this. But it would be, I think, a bit of both. In terms of the political sort of map right now in India, there are a number of parties, the number of political parties. What we find worryingly is that none of them are vociferously standing for the principles that the Constitution provides, which is that secular principle. Now, are there legitimate arguments to be had on why the BJP ideology is gaining ground at a time when I just mentioned that after 47 and the killing of Mahatma Gandhi after 1948, there was a turning away from any kind of religious state. And bit of it is where we are in the world today. Part of it is also post 9/11 war on terror narrative that was all over the world, and it has created generated a sort of Islamophobia which is fed into the political pressures. The BJP has never sort of hidden its ideology, because affiliated to the RSS, which of course has always claimed that Hindu majoritarian nationalism. So therefore, it is why people are taking that side. My concern would be not political. Voting for the BJP is not my concern. My concern is when institutions break down, when there is public stigmatization of communities, if people are not hired because of their religion, if people are not given apartments, rented apartments because of their religion, that kind of bias that enters into society is much harder to break. Political parties come and go, and they often have a discourse that wins them votes, but then they leave behind a legacy which can be extremely disruptive to the social fabric.
Right. So they are existing fissures in Indian society, and they are being exacerbated today, right, by sort of the dominant ideology at the national level. Yeah. So I guess sort of my next question is sort of to pick up on the other thread that you left for us in your opening remarks, which is the Bhima Koregaon case, right? And one tool that we have seen the government increasingly resort to in persecution of civil society activists, right? And you spotlighted the Bhima Koregaon case as perhaps like the defining example of it, with up to 15 leading intellectuals and activists in prison for that case. I would just love to hear your thoughts more about, and also for people in the audience who are not necessarily familiar with it, I would love to hear you speak a bit more to that. But B, I think specifically in terms of a question, I'm wondering sort of how could we, and we I'm defining very broadly as the people of India or the civil society of India or the political activists in India, how could we have countered the Bhima Koregaon case or responded to it in a more effective way? Because part of what's happened is that there really has been no movement on that front from in terms of victories, right? Like Stan Swami had to pass away in jail because of the inaction that was seen. So what could have been done better, and how can we learn from this case going forward?
So one of the things that the civil society, active civil society, has always been intellectuals who have tended to be more left of center in their political leaning, and that particular ideology is very unsavory, perhaps, to the BJP. and therefore, there is always, I've heard BJP leaders tell me also about a university, the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, which has also had that same history described to me, that whole environment should be shut down. There is a rewriting of history because they believe that it's been written by leftist intellectuals. There are, I think, a number of professors and teachers in US, from Indian origin, who teach in the US, who are also often being discredited for that, for in that view. Now, the Bhima Koregaon case is interesting because Bhima Koregaon case, Bhima Koregaon is a place where Dalits celebrate a victory back in the age of Peshawar and the Peshwas. Because it was a Dalit celebration, there were support from actually a judge who helped organize this. He'd invited a number of people. A number of people who are arrested in this case were actually not even present at that function. Violence broke out. We've not yet seen a proper investigation into what exactly happened, but apparently a Hindu group did attack this meeting. Initially, the cases were filed against the leaders of that mob, but soon it was reversed, and 16 people, activists, were arrested, including Stan Samami, who later died in custody. These are all people with a history of work with India's most marginalized, with Adivasis, with Dalits. And therefore, it is really unfortunate that they should have been silenced in this way. They've been in prison for a long time now. Some have been released on bail, but medical bail and so on. But it's really, it's quite unfortunate that they're still in custody. What does this tell us? It tells us about laws that are deployed to keep people in custody. If you're accused of sedition, sedition is a law that was enacted by British colonials to jail people who sought independence of India. So Gandhi was accused of sedition, as Nehru and all these other leaders of that independence movement, and including actually even BJP's RSS leaders that RSS supports, they were also accused of sedition. So, but that law still exists, and it's a serious charge. So when it's brought before court, the courts never give bail. The other is India's counter-terror law. Now, all over the world, governments have enacted the counter-terror law because terrorism is a real threat to human rights. The indiscriminate attacks upon civilians has caused tremendous harm across communities. And therefore, we do need tough laws to address this. But those laws cannot be misused to just target your critics. That's where the problem lies. India also has an armed movement led by Maoists. And the government believes that these activists are somehow aligned with the Maoists. And there is a narrative, as I said, often, that narrative also builds out. And one of the terms that is used is called urban Naxals, that these are people that are city dwellers who support the Maoists. The problem is there isn't enough evidence. If there was evidence, then they can be prosecuted. But why are they in jail still? Until then they should be released and let the trial proceed. If there's evidence, let's see that evidence that the state can produce. So therefore, at this point of time, the process becomes the punishment in many cases. And that same thing is also happening around the CAA protest, the Citizenship Amendment Act protest, because there too, activists and protesters are still in jail, accused under these laws.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think one of the important takeaways there is that sort of the situation we are in today has multiple forces of influence, right? And of course, one is the present political moment in India, but the other really important force is the force of history, right? And the history of colonial era sedition laws, which were unchallenged after independence and continue to be so today. And then the other force is the force of global movements, right? The post 9/11 moment when terrorism became a global hot button issue, and sort of anti-terrorism laws became a tool that was at the disposal of the government to crack down on criticism. So it really is not just in problem of the present moment. It's a sort of deeper and larger problem than that. But there is also something very contemporary about it. And you, again, left us a thread of the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, the FCRA, as one of the key inventions, actually, of the union government since 2014 to sort of pressure and silence civil society organizations. Could you perhaps speak more to sort of how the FCRA has been used and misused to intimidate civil society activists, and if the Human Rights Watch has had trouble navigating the new regulatory regime surrounding financing?
Sure, thank you, Ravi. So the FCRA is actually a law from 1976, and it was initially brought in around the time of the Cold War to prevent either, because India was non-aligned, prevent either of the superpowers to interfere with India's political journey. India was, so that was why it was brought in. However, what happened is that over the years, that law kept changing and becoming more and more targeted towards civil society activists, who, because the term is political, and by its very nature, civil society is political, because civil society creates in itself the possibility of informing the state of poor policy and seeking reform. And therefore, in its engagement, is often has to take political stance. I mean, and what is not political? Climate work is political, health work is political, education work is political. Almost everything, when you're seeking rights, is political. But it was a broad term, and that is how it was used. So it was something that we had, also found problematic in previous governments. In 2008, I think, or 2010, maybe, the previous government of Manmohan Singh had also toughened this law somewhat to target groups. In fact, Greenpeace, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and others were investigated by that government at that point of time under FCRA. But the BJP has toughened this law to the point where it is only targeting human rights groups, while at the same time the idea of preventing outside and unaccounted for wealth in political movements and political parties has now been removed. So through electoral bonds, which are secret, political parties can receive money from anywhere. However, people that are serving communities are now facing tremendous restrictions, and quite often are being punished on technical grounds, on administrative grounds, and their licenses are not renewed. What that means is that because India as yet does not have a robust philanthropic culture, all these groups that rely on foreign funding from foreign donors to function are no longer able to function. In addition, of course, there is also the problem that a lot of groups that work on these issues, if they're funded by domestically, those donors are anxious that they might be punished by the state. They can face visits from various, tax auditors or enforcement directorate and so on. So they're also careful about who they want to fund. So there isn't that much available, though it is developing in India. It has the capacity to support its own civil society, and we do hope that it will go in that direction at some point. But I will leave to Aakar to speak about Amnesty, because they have had problems that he should be able to speak to.
Absolutely, and I stand corrected. So the FCRA is also a historical force at play, of course, amplified in the current political moment, but a historical force nonetheless. So I know the question section is buzzing, but I have one question that I really want to ask, so I'm going to go for it, but then I'll hand it over to the audience. But you sort of pointed to the fact that there's one way of understanding civil society as a voice of dissent, of advocating for citizens and for people against the state or other stakeholders in society. But there's also a quote unquote constructive role that civil society plays in governance and policy making, as providing expertise to the government, or as being a voice for the people who are not necessarily represented in political or policy making circles. So how is the scope for that sort of quote unquote constructive civil society participation in the state, in politics and policy making changed? Has that role expanded? Has it diminished? where does civil society stand in that regard?
Unfortunately, there is a breakdown in trust because yes, India is a giant country. It's over a billion people. There is the governance structure has always been one where civil society engagement has existed at every level, and it has needed to, because how else will people transact? I mean, I have been to villages in India where the only state presence is the local police station and the local postman. They do not see state. They when they need support, how do they even get that help? And therefore, civil society has played a role in creating those support structures, enabling legal action, enabling access to the criminal justice system. And unfortunately, a lot of that is facing some challenge now. I'll give you an example of what happened during the lockdown of 2020, when the pandemic first hit the world. India's lockdown came with a 4-hour notice. People did not have food supplies. People did not, they didn't know where they would land. We, of course, have seen the millions that tried to march home from the cities. But even at the community level, it was groups, residential associations, village communities, church groups, temple groups that banded together to provide, particularly for people who could not get out, could not access. There is that community support that is still a very strong fabric. And when I speak about India's secular democracy, that is the one that I fear is being damaged, because there is a violence that is entering into society now, where people feel they can slap someone or beat someone up because there's a disagreement, because there is that that enabling sort of vigilante action that is now entered into various layers of society, which breaks down what was earlier the strongest fabric that held India together, because the state could not deliver. But at the broader level, of course, all of us have worked with government. We still work with government and I work in South Asia, I work with governments in all of these countries, because eventually all these rights have to be delivered by the state. It is the engagement with the state that will enable good decisions, good policies which will eventually lead to public good. So that collaboration is very, very important, but it requires trust on both sides. And right now, in India, the ruling BJP has great distrust of civil society because it feels that it cannot tolerate any sort of criticism. So that is why we are in a bit of bind.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal answer, and that leaves me begging to ask more questions along those lines. But I promise to defer to the audience, so I shall. The first question is from an anonymous attendee, but it asks, how does the current level of polarization and citizen vigilantism affect the day-to-day work of human rights groups and efforts to document abuses and violations of national and international standards of rights?
It's become increasingly harder for a number of reasons. One is, of course, if there isn't enough funding, there is therefore much harder capacity to document things, because you have to go to areas and to meet with people, you have to secure them, the victims, provide support to the victim groups. So it has diminished to a large part. There is also, as I said, a bit of self-censorship and fear that has come in. So for instance, I remember there was a group of lawyers who used to work in Chhattisgarh to support Adivasi communities who would be accused of supporting the Naxals. Now in the Adivasi communities where the Maoists operate, for instance, we would often find that they were caught between security forces and the Maoists. They would, both groups, both sets of guns would prey upon them for support and for information, and they were therefore at risk from both sides. And yet we found hundreds of people were being picked up on a routine basis. And these group of lawyers were trying to help them file cases and assist them when, to secure bail and so on. And they were attacked. This was earlier by some supporters of the government. So that, that granular level of work, the right to information activists are often coming under attack. and so many have been killed. So that there is much, it's become much harder. In terms of the polarization, that is where I think there is that, which is why I spoke to that most, because I think that is where India is most at threat. You know, the narrative of Muslims can go back where they came from, which seems to be the popular narrative that a lot of fairly uninformed, I suppose, supporters of the government keep saying, is nonsensical. The population of India is larger than many countries, so therefore they are not going. And anyway, they why should they go? There is nowhere that they can go back to. So the, you know, to try and create that narrative of not feeling welcome is going to harm the structures within India that have been so robust until now.
Right. Our next question is from Ryan Sood, who's a student here at Stanford University. And he asks, there are at least two major sources of dissent to the erosion of civil liberties. One is intellectual civil society, typically sourced from urban upper castes and classes. And the other is, you know, on the ground identity or issue-based resistance from activists or local political leaders. How can sort of the urban civil society ecosystem build collaboration with these ground level leaders and help each other in resistance?
Superb question. India's history has obviously been one which inherited the feudalism of the past. So the elite of India has traditionally been that upper caste, English-speaking, privileged classes. One of the magical things about India's democracy and its successes is that it has created political space for groups to emerge, which is why the Prime Minister today speaks about having come from a family that once sold tea, because it's contrast with the previous rulers. I remember there was a politician from Haryana who, when he took office, insisted that the posh hotels of Delhi should also have cow shelters. You know, there is a certain rise and a certain voice that is already emerging, which is actually very welcome. And that voice and that rise and that and some of it is the outcome of education, some of it is the outcome of an economy doing better, and it has led to new aspiration. And I feel that it is the aspiration that should be channeled in the right direction. That aspiration should not be channeled into hate. It has to be channeled into productive development, supporting others, and that conversation has to happen. Has it begun? I feel not as much as it should. I think there is still in Indian society that people living in different classes, in different worlds that all cohabit together. You know, I mean, we speak quite often of the high rises in Bombay and the slums below. So there are those differences that have always existed, that are visible and often invisible when it's in a rural urban context. And yet not enough of that bridging has occurred, and more should be done.
Right. So it's a complicated problem, and we're about to complicate it further, because we have a couple of questions about sort of how non-resident Indians, so NRIs or diasporas, second generation or third generation diasporas, who are invested in a free and just India, can help support this work without, you know, poisoning the well, given this nativist nationalist moment in Indian political history.
You know, one of the things that I find fascinating, because there are so many of us, right? We have just so many Indians and we are all over the place. Although right now there is such a pushback against immigration and refugees in India, Indians seem to forget that they have scattered through the ages in various places. And one of the reasons that we find that is when the Prime Minister of India travels, there are large groups of people that keep turning up to greet him. Of course, there was the big one where your President Trump and Prime Minister Modi attended some thing and there was a lot of people there as well. So I find it fascinating because I don't know how Indians would react, for instance, if suddenly Americans living in India emerged and started sort of, supporting their leaders or any other Europeans and so on. Certainly, Sonia Gandhi's Italian birth is never forgiven or forgotten. So I find it quite extraordinary. What can the diaspora community do? I think the diaspora community has enjoyed, particularly in North America and Europe, have enjoyed a lot of the freedoms that those societies have accorded and provided to its citizens. Yes, they face race issues, they face discrimination in many ways, but they have enjoyed the benefits of a largely free society. And therefore, they have been allowed, they have practiced their faith in the way they want to, they practice their cultures in the way they want to. So therefore, I often worry that they seem to be less protective of those same freedoms for people back home. So we find that they are often a large amount of money, for instance, comes to the BJP from diaspora groups. And they believe that that is because they have an idea of India, of a glorious past, which is as nebulous as America being great again. At which point of history are they referring to? It's the same thing with India. You want to make, the reclaim a glorious past. Which past? Was it the past when when brides were being burnt? Which past do you want? Was it Harappa? Was it which past? So therefore, it's for historians, it's always a bit befuddling, because for the diaspora communities, I would say that because they are so successful and their success is so celebrated, the CEOs of various companies that are appointed are make frontline page news in India, and we are all very proud. We would like them to find voice, to find voice where they push back against some of the things that are happening in their communities back home, or even their communities within the countries where they live, who are promoting principles that they don't themselves have to, those are not common to their own experience. They want that kind of hardship or discrimination or bigotry to be promoted elsewhere.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, as someone who's currently in the US, I experience this a lot myself in my conversations I have with people who have connections to India here, and so I'm utterly fascinated myself by the politics of culture and nationalism in the diaspora community. So I really appreciate that answer. Our next question is from another attendee today.
I think you're muted.
We lost your sound, Ravi. I'm not sure what happened.
Hi, can you hear me?
You're a little soft, but we can hear you.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Sorry about that. I had a technical malfunction myself. But the question is sort of, how do communities and legislators begin to combat the intimidation and violence and surveillance networks in towns? For example, the surveillance of social media to identify and target mixed-faith couples, or even the everyday routine surveillance at this point of specifically Muslim communities and community members engaged in anything to do with cattle, right, under suspicions of trading in beef or slaughter of cows. So how do communities respond to this sort of community level vigilance that has increasingly become common?
Thank you. Yes, it is a of that target Muslims and particularly Muslim women. How do we counter it? As human rights groups, we are fairly, and you're in the US, and so as I suppose a number of your fellow students, the freedom of expression has been quite the maximalist thing for all of us as activists. And when the internet first came about, we believed that it was going to create that platform where everyone would have a voice. It would be the great leveler. We would no longer need, and to a large part is true as well, right? A lot of people a lot of celebrity friends of mine, for instance, tell me that they now can communicate with their fans directly instead of having, a journalist who would come and interview them and not present well. So there were always the good things about it, level of information that we are able to access and so on. But it has also created a platform for the disgruntled And it has also created that platform and then enabled that platform to promote hate and, most worryingly, to incite violence. So therefore, for us right now, there is that conundrum of how the state should respond. And we find, as with the criminal justice system and how it responds to government supporters versus government critics in prosecuting people, we find that same thing occurring even in speech, including online speech, where criticism is punished quite robustly, but online hate is not. And there needs to be a lot more done to sort of end this. And to that, there is also the social media platforms themselves. These are big companies. I mean, we know that Facebook in its internal investigations has found that its platform was used for the violence against Rohingya, the violence that happened in Sri Lanka. There needs to be more responsibility even from those platforms in how they are going to transact these conversations, and whether it will lead particularly to prevent violence targeting those that they don't like.
Right. I think sort of relatedly, right, is also the sort of role of the judiciary, and Professor Ram Mohan Tirga has a question about that, right? It's important to recognize the decline of the judiciary in this whole story of, a declining quality of democracy in India. And we cannot really say sort of why it is that the judiciary has become weak, and there's multiple sort of interpretations to that. It could be sort of, a lack of courage to stand up in this particular sort of political environment, or it might be sort of the overall hegemony of the ruling party's ideology at this moment. But why is it that sort of the court system has failed to be a significant sort of voice that stands up for civil liberties in these troubled times? And has it always been the case, or is this sort of a newer development in the evolution of politics in India? Dr. Ganguly, yeah, go ahead.
I can't see the question that you were asking. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the question is by Professor Ram Mohan Tirga. It's been marked as answered live now. So it's in the answered section of the chat box.
Okay.
And it asks about sort of the decline in the judiciary in this whole story, and sort of says that there's multiple reasons as to perhaps why the judiciary has not been the ally that it should have been, in this fight for preserving, the quality of Indian democracy. So, is there sort of any views that you have in terms of, why the judiciary has behaved the way it has in this particular moment? And in what ways is the judiciary's behavior a departure or a break from the past?
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, the Constitution of India protects a number of rights. It sets out what the judiciary will and will not do, or should or should not do. What we find is it's a mixed bag. We have found that there have been some very good judgments that have come. And don't forget, in the end, as I said, there is only the judiciary that we can approach, because in the way that it's all played out, the allegations are made, the police makes a case, the media, which is very pro-government, will deem a person guilty before trial, and then there is the long court process. In some cases, there has been relief. What is worrying is cases where there has not been relief, and a sort of second guessing perhaps of what the political ideology might be, or even perhaps what the judiciary might believe themselves, as opposed to how to enforce the rule of law. We still welcome some of the good judgments. One of the best judgments in recent times has been on Section 377, which upholds the adult same-sex relationships. And it's important because it's the same law that prevails across the Commonwealth. It was again a British law. And so therefore it does set a precedent for us to be able to take that case forward. And I see Aakar has joined. So I should cede ground to Aakar now. Good morning, Aakar.
It's a pleasure to have you here today, Mr. Patel, and we would love to hear more about your your thoughts on the state of civil society in India today at this particular moment. And if you could speak to FCRA, that would be great as well.
Sure. I'll try and speak of things that Meenakshi may not have already covered. There is a political frame to what has happened here, and that comes out of a speech that the Prime Minister made on the 21st of May in 2016, where he said that civil society was out to finish his government and he would go after them before they did so. This was widely reported, but it wasn't taken to mean the sort of attack that came on civil society soon after. So I think that the political establishment in India doesn't want civil society, particularly that part of it that looks at constitutional rights, to either not only to not succeed, but to exist. So that is the political frame. The constitutional frame is that while we notionally have freedoms, Article 19 gives us the freedoms to free speech, to association, to peaceful assembly. All of these are also criminalized, and they have been for some time. We should not just be looking at a post-2014 timeline here, that freedom of expression is curtailed through criminal defamation, criminal contempt, sedition. There's a series of laws that the state can use. And the state doesn't need to use these laws anymore because fear of the mob and of violence keeps people quiet, which has, once again, this is not a recent development, but it has accelerated in time. Peaceful assembly is a notional freedom. In the US, in parts of Europe, protesters can gather with banners outside government offices, outside corporate offices, outside factories, and a protest. You can't do that here in India. So you've got to fill out a form. You've got to seek. It's a fundamental right, but the right actually belongs to the police. The police have the right to let you know whether or not it will let you protest. And if you do so without a permission in writing, they can pick you up. Many cities in this country are permanently under 144, which restricts the gathering of 4 or more people. The right to association has been hit by the FCRA before 2014, but it has been really tightened and squeezed. Did Meenakshi take you through the changes that were put in place after 2020 in the law? No. Okay, so there are 3-4 changes in the main. One is that no matter where you are registered and set up in the country, you can only operate the foreign money coming into your account through one branch of one bank in Delhi. So if you're in Nagaland or if you're in Chennai, it doesn't matter. You're going to come to Delhi, set up the account there, and operate the funds only out of there. Secondly, and this, just to be clear, this is not a restriction that's put on any other part of the private sector. Secondly, only 20% of that money can be used in what the government calls administrative expenses, which means all salaries, all rent, all travel, and so on, which for many NGOs is the dominant component of the work that they do. But now they can spend only 1/5 of the money coming in on that. Once again, this is not something that the private sector is told. Corporates are not told that you can only spend 1/5 of your money in this way. The third restriction is on regranting. If 2 NGOs, one in the city and one working in the grassroots, both have the FCRA, it is now not possible for the one in the city to work with the to regrant the money to the one working grassroots. And this hurts because the civil society sector doesn't compete with one another to the extent that the rest of the private sector does. We tend to cooperate, and this blocks cooperation. The last important point is that even if you have an FCRA, your registration under as a charitable trust comes up for renewal every 5 years now with the income tax department. And so the government has its hand on the lever, and it can switch you off pretty much if and when it wants, based on the IT registration. So it's not just the FCRA thing. Even your income tax registration will now, which was permanent earlier, now will come up for renewal every 5 years. Effectively, we have killed the sector off. I should put it in perspective. Civil society and NGOs are the third largest employer, private sector employer in the US. About 10.5% of people, of US workers outside the government work in the NGO sector. In 25 states in the US, it's the largest. It employs more people than all parts of manufacturing put together. So this is the sector we're trying to kill. And I think in large measure, we have hurt it to the extent that it's difficult for people to conceive of this as being a profession that they want to join. And lastly, I'll say that this has hurt the country as well. That what we are doing is not in the domain of democratic spaces. What we've done to the NGO sector in India, the hurt that we have inflicted on it is of a piece with more authoritarian states. So this is what has been going on in India for long, but particularly after 2016.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Patel, for that very rich and multi-textured sort of analysis of the FCRA, right? There's multiple stories here. There is the economic aspect of it, as you pointed out, which sort of gets underplayed, actually, I think, in dominant narratives in the media. Then there's a constitutional element to it, which sort of it restricts the freedom of association. It is guaranteed by the fundamental rights. And then there's the sort of the political aspect of it, right, which obviously threatens democracy in very evident ways. I'm wondering if you could speak more to sort of how the FCRA has hurt Amnesty International in particular, because I know Amnesty has a particularly conflicted with FCRA.
Yeah, so the history is that Amnesty was set up here 50 years ago and has been episodically in India off and on for 5 times, I think. It started with George Fernandez being a member in the early 70s. But each time a different set of people would take up the brand and would set up their own trust or their own company. We don't have the FCRA currently, and we've not had it. One of the previous avatars, of whose all trustees are now dead, did have it at one point. But what we are accused of is that Amnesty Limited, which is the secretariat in London, is registered as a company. We also registered one entity here as a company. The government says, I don't know under what law, that this is a violation of FCRA. And I'm saying I don't know under what law because we haven't been charged yet formally. What the action that's been taken against us has been on 3 fronts. We were raided by the Enforcement Directorate in October 2018, and we had our accounts frozen because due process was not followed. We moved a writ in High Court and we got the accounts unfrozen. Following that, there was a raid from the CBI on the same set of transactions a year later in November 2019, after which the Enforcement Directorate once again froze the accounts, this time under money laundering charges. But formal charges, once again, have not been framed. Once again, due process was not followed. Once again, we got relief, but this time we only got marginal relief, and there were some problems. One is that judgment gave us access to our bank account, but put the wrong bank account number, and then the court refused to change the order. So we've moved Supreme Court, and we've been heard. We have a date for the 18th of July. We are hoping that we are able to get back in. This is so far as Amnesty is concerned. A lot of FCRA goes into church-based, faith-based organizations. So these are organizations that have existed in India for a long time. These are especially the ones that the government has targeted, saying that what is happening in India. Once again, Article 25, the right to freely propagate, is both a criminal offense and a fundamental right. So the government tells you on one hand that this is this freedom that you have, go and spread your faith. And it also tells you that the moment you do that, we'll put you in jail, which it does. So my guess is that though of course Ashoka University has done a lot of research on this, Ingrid Srinath in particular, my guess is that the largest hit has been taken by the faith-based organizations. So far as Amnesty is concerned, because most of our work requires only people to do research, issue statements, to look at the laws and policies and so on, we can in some form continue even if we are restricted. So that's what we are doing at the moment. We are putting out statements based on things that we see, but we are hopeful that very soon we'll be able to access our funds again.
Right. Right. Now, I think, Mr. Patel, one of the sort of dominant sort of themes that stands out in your answer is that the due process of law has not been followed, right? And the government of India's dealings with Amnesty International in particular. And we were just having a discussion on the role of the judiciary, in sort of safeguarding civil liberties and protecting civil society in India. Do you have any sort of thoughts on sort of what the role of the judiciary has been and how the behavior of the judiciary currently is different from or the same as its behavior in the past?
So in our part of the world, whenever you have a strong leader, the rest of the polity succumbs to the leader. So think of it as being a sort of kingship or a queenship, that whatever contract, social contracts parts of the state may have with the population, they tend to become softer when you have a powerful leader. So that we are going through at this point in time. And I suppose in many ways it's similar to 75, 77, in some ways at least. And this extends to the judiciary, which becomes soft and is pliant and almost a part of the executive. We've been hearing phrases like the executive court, which is what it has become, that the judges tend to take the side of the prosecution, even when it comes to fundamental rights. That is one part. The second part is there is a majoritarianism that has seeped into the polity and into the population and into structures like the media post 2014, and has been validated by the popularity of Mr. Modi, which has also seeped into the judiciary. So this will be slightly more difficult to be rid of. That this is not just the strong leader coming in, and once he or she leaves, then you tend to go back to being the normative state that you wanted to be. Here it is the fact that long-term changes have been put in place and are already in place, structural changes that will will ensure that whatever guarantees individuals, especially minorities, have under the constitution can be overturned through just an insistence of this populism. So just my insistence that I be allowed to pray somewhere will mean that judges will feel confident enough to overlook the law. Just my insistence that Muslims not be allowed to pray in spaces that have been allocated to them by the state will ensure that, and I keep showing up week after week, creating a nuisance, the state will then become soft and it will let go of its authority. India has devolved authority to the mob. So the Weberian idea of the state being the only legitimate holder of the use of force has been undone to a large extent in India, that the mob can wield legitimate authority. And I think that one aspect of that has also seeped into the judiciary, which is that laws can be undone when it comes to can you hear me? Yeah, laws can be undone when it comes to the rights of the majority.
Right. No, those are very powerful words, Mr. Patel. Sort of, the state has wielded the mob. We were just having a discussion on sort of, how communities can respond to the fact that there's increasing vigilantism, right, in surveillance of interfaith couples, in the surveillance of intercaste couples, in the alleged business of beef smuggling and beef trading, right? This is like an increased level of vigilance at the community level. How do you think community leaders and legislators can respond to this mob justice frenzy that has taken over?
So we need to understand that this is coming from the state. So since 2018, 7 BJP states have passed laws that criminalize interfaith marriage, and the judiciary has looked on. We've also reversed burden of proof. So an adult woman's testimony that she converted of free volition is insufficient evidence for the state in India, that it is for the man she's marrying and the family she's marrying into to prove that there was no coercion. Couples have to fill out forms in some states, give 60 days notice to the state before they want to marry. So the state is sending the signal saying to society, whether you think of society as being the mob, which in many instances it is, or society in the general sense, where it becomes normalized, that such thing that interfaith marriage is a crime, the idea becomes normalized. The same thing has happened with beef, that the criminalization of the possession of beef with a reversal of burden of proof came after 2015 and Mr. Modi's speeches against what he called the pink revolution. And so you've got cases like one in Gujarat in 2019, where a Muslim man was accused of serving beef at his daughter's wedding. Government couldn't prove that this was the case. Court sentenced him to 10 years, saying that since the state can't prove, it's for you to prove. So there also the burden of proof has been reversed, as it has been reversed on the citizenship side as well. So the state is doing the mischief here. I think that the devolution of authority to the mob has happened, but it has happened in concert with the state saying that this is the sort of society we want to be, that we want to be a society that constantly tortures its minorities, and its a primary orientation is not towards the economy or towards national security, but inwards. This is a very fierce nationalism that is aimed inward at its own people and radiates out from both the state and from the mob.
Right. That's a very powerful analysis, right? It's the state that is devolved by its own intention, power to the mob, and created fissures that are ever widening and ever spreading across the society and the political institutions. So I want to be conscious of time. We're already a little over time, but I want to end on a note of optimism after having covered a lot of ground in terms of all the devastation that has been wreaked upon India's civil society and political institutions. So what, if any, and I would love to hear from both our panelists on this question, what, if anything, is a source of hope? Like, where's redemption? Where's it going to come from? And do you see it in the works now?
Or do you want me to go first? Or?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, so no, the long future is always good. So what Martin Luther King Jr. calls the arc of history, that is always good, that we've won every battle. What is called the left has won every battle on civil rights, whether it is from slavery to the right to women's suffrage, colonialism, on caste, untouchability, everything has been won. So we will win. There is no doubt about that. The question is when. I think one of the problems India has is that it also has an economic problem, that we've got the lowest labor force participation rate in South Asia. It's as low as Somalia's. We are in a time when you can't transition hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into a middle income and higher middle income status because you don't have those volumes of manufacturing left anymore. That bus has already left the station, that train has left the station. But I also think that because humanity faces joint challenges such as climate change, there will be a positive and benign influence on the rest of humanity towards nation states that are behaving in the way that we are at the moment. And I think that we won't be able to escape that. One reason why the 17-month internet blockade on Kashmir was lifted was House Resolution 745 in the US Congress, which caused the Foreign Minister of India to run away from a meeting with Congresswoman Jaipal. One reason why, and then the blockade was lifted 6 days after the Biden administration took over, 17-month blockade. One reason why CAA is law yet but has not been enforced on the ground is that there's a very condemnatory resolution against it in the European Parliament, which once again Jaishankar went to Brussels and probably told them not to vote on it. So I think that 15, 20 years down the line, we should be fine. But I think that it will be terrible for the next 15 years, at least. And I think that while I accept that it will be terrible, I must also say that we need to do what it is that we can now to either slow down the process of decay, to try and control the levels of violence that have been inflicted on society, to try and do whatever it is possible to make sure that we return to a normative state. We are in the place where the ideological and the prerogative state is dominating the narrative everywhere, including the media. So we need to push back against it to the extent that we can, with the hope that the long future will be good.
Yes, ma'am, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I would possibly agree with Aakar on everything that he has said. In addition, I would perhaps also say that right now, just seeing the example of Sri Lanka, which is in the immediate neighborhood, which also had a very populist and aggressive leadership. citizens in the end require services. They expect their government and their state to provide services. And however much you can drip hate into this narrative to sort of, continue, in the end, hating somebody else is not going to find you a job or put food on your table or build you a house or buy you a car or all the other aspirations that people have. So I do feel that hate is very hard to sustain long term. So it is in the interest of the Indian government to actually focus on governance. It's now, been 2 terms in office, and we have not as yet seen that commitment of progress, development that was brought about. And even in the seeking of universal recognition and glory, which this government promised, we are finding, as Aakar said, increasing concern. So there might be geopolitical reasons or market reasons for why India has continued to be sort of quoted by various governments. But in the end, those standards will still be ones that the international community will require of India. So there will be some pressure. But I think it is going to be more both domestic and international pressure that will bring that change. And for now, yes, I agree that we have to work towards upholding the basic principles that we believe in.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for this uplifting answers. I said I was the last question, but I will ask one more question posed by the director of the CSA, Professor Anna Bigelow. And I'll ask that you keep your answers short, but I suspect that your answers will also be short at this one. But she asks, one of the greatest thinkers in US history, James Baldwin, wrote that it was his love for America that was the basis upon which he critiqued America. And given this moment that we are in, where such critiques are portrayed as seditious, rather than the reflections of deep investments people have in making their nations more just and honest, does love inform your criticism? Both of you as panelists today, is it love that motivates you, or what is it that motivates you?
There is, for every member of civil society, a difference between love of the state and love of their people. I think most members of civil society are in the business of what they're doing because they love their people, and they have the shared dreams and the aspirations. They do not necessarily have to love the state or its policies.
Mr. Patel, do you have any?
I agree with what Meenakshi has said. You don't get into this space without really having an abiding love for your people, and I would agree with her that for me, my country is its people.
That was an extremely uplifting note to end on, with optimism and love in the air. Thank you so much to both our panelists for this scintillating conversation we have had today. I really enjoyed this whirlwind and everything we've covered today, and I'm really optimistic about the nation going forward as well. So thank you for joining us today and sharing your views. Thank you to all our attendees. And finally, thank you to the Center for South Asia, Professor Bigelow, Lalita, and Simrat for making this space available to us and for consistently putting out brilliant programming for community members at Stanford and to the general public. It's been an honor being the CSA Markaz Fellow this year, and I look forward to where the Center for South Asia goes forward in the future. So thank you, everyone.